All right, you guys, as you can see by the thumbnail, I'm back with another one like the other one. So check it out, you guys. I got another banger for you. This one's about the LA County Jail. It's called the LA County Jail Gang Module. I want to get straight to it. I got stories lined up for you guys. I want to try to get them out as fast as I can. Like I've been saying, I'm trying to get my numbers up. So without further ado, let me get into it. So like I said, you guys, this story is about the LA County Jail. You guys have heard me talk about quite a few of these stories when it comes to the LA County Jail, and they always seem to garner a lot of attention. You know, in some sense, I think it has a lot to do with the history of this jail and some of the other stories that are always coming out of there. It's definitely a place where survival of the fittest rings true and where every aspect of being a hardcore convict is going to be tested. I've never been to the LA County Jail myself, but during all the years that I was part of that arena, the arena of doing time, I heard a lot of stories about that jail, and a lot of these stories were intriguing. You hear about the usual stabbings and some of the murkings that come out of there, which is commonplace amongst most of the other hardcore jails and prisons. But there's a few more layers here, and there's a lot more involved when it comes to the LA County Jail. Aside from the caliber of inmate that this jail is known to house, you also hear stories about some of the officers that work there and the gang mentality that they themselves have adopted. Then there's the gang modules and how they operate. There's the constant threat and level of violence that permeates within that jail, the constant head-up fights that you always hear the Crips and Bloods talk about, the old school elevator rides. And then of course, there's the fact that this jail is considered to be a stronghold to criminal organizations like the Mexican Mafia and the Aryan Brotherhood. You know, I've talked to active MM members, Surenos, Crips, Bloods, and even ABs and NLR members that had all been there, and they were all of the same mindset that if you could survive places like Wayside in the LA County Jail, then you could pretty much survive anywhere. They've all said the same thing, that this is a jail that will test your mettle when it comes to being a real hardcore convict. And when it comes to gangs and gang violence, it's probably one of the worst county jails in Southern California, and quite possibly maybe even in the entire state of California for that matter. I mean, when you've got to deal with some of the elements that come along with being in an environment like the LA County Jail, I'm talking about gang politics, the racial conflicts, and the chance of being thrown in the water with a bunch of sharks and piranhas is one thing. But on top of all that, when you run the risk of being used as live chum, that's something that's on another level. I know I'm speaking in metaphors, but metaphorically speaking, what I mean is this. I've heard stories about some of the officers that work in the LA County Jail, and I've heard how they interject themselves in gang politics, and that can be dangerous, and I'll tell you why. Sometimes in certain situations when somebody's getting packed out or mollywopped, the best case scenario for them is for an alarm to go off or for the unit officers to respond. If you're a victim and you're in a situation like this, they can't get there fast enough. These are facts. And if you're a gang member that's deeply involved within that spectrum, then there's certain things that you're going to expect from the county jail officers, even if you're active and claim to be affiliated. If you're an active gang member and you go into a county jail, you're going to have some level of expectation for these guys to house you in an area based on your affiliation and your compatibility. That's their job. And this doesn't mean that you let your guard down. You always keep your head on a swivel, knowing that anything can still happen. Anytime you go into a new environment, your awareness should always be peaking. And although you're fully aware of the fact that it can happen, you still wouldn't expect for these guys to throw you in a housing unit where you have nothing but mortal enemies. And that if they did, there's a good chance that it could end up being fatal for you. You know, an active gang member might not admit it, but in a situation like this, you can bet your bottom dollar that he would be hoping and praying that help's on the way. That he would be hoping that deputies are going to be running in there any minute to come save his ass. And I say they won't admit it because of the whole ego factor thing. It sounds weak to say that you were hoping that the deputies will come in and stop it. So here's a hypothetical. Let's say you're talking about a norteño from Northern California that gets caught up in Southern California and ends up in the LA County Jail. County jail protocol or classification protocol requires them to isolate this guy or to segregate him at the very least, because they know that if they throw this guy in the gang module or in a 6-man tank with 5 other Surenos, there's a good chance he's gonna lose his life. The probability of that happening is very high. On the flip side of it, if you're active, you're supposed to go wherever they house you. regardless of how precarious or how bad the situation is that you end up landing in. You're supposed to keep your mouth shut and handle your business, no matter how bad it gets. People can spin this however they want to spin it, but no matter how you cut it, that's what you're supposed to do. But what happens when you encounter a situation where you've got a dirty cop who's vested somehow, some way in these politics, and he throws protocol to the wind? Maybe he's got a younger brother that took the other route growing up, and instead of staying in school and doing something productive with his life, instead he got clicked up and became a gang member. Or maybe this cop just favors Surenos because he's from Southern California, and up until this point, he's never dealt with a norteño before. Regardless of how it happens, his outlook has become jilted and tainted. And now, instead of doing his job and housing this norteño somewhere where he knows he's not going to have any issues, instead he interjects himself and says, you know what? I'm going to house this guy with the boys. I'm going to throw him to the wolves. That norteño's cooked. They're going to stomp him out as soon as the tier clears. No, that's a bad situation to be in, but it happens all the time. And when it does, you're supposed to ride it out and deal with it however it comes. Anyways, before I move on, let me point one other thing out to you guys. This is how dirty gang politics can be. You know, like I said, for that norteño, if he's active, he's supposed to go wherever they house him. Even if he knows he's walking the plank and he's probably being led to his demise. If he doesn't, it's considered an act of cowardice. But it gets better than that. Let's just say this guy gets to the gang module and he can see through the windows before they let him in that there's about 20 to 25 Surenos. Not a good situation to be in, right? If that norteño sticks to the code and plays by all the rules, he's supposed to step into that tank and wait for the officers to leave the tier before he gets off and handles his business. Of course, it would be nice if he could just go in and take flight on the closest individual that he comes into contact with immediately. Because if it goes down like this, then the deputies are going to break it up, they're going to take him out of there, and it's not going to be so bad. But that's not how an active gang member who lives by the code is supposed to do it. Some would argue vigorously that this is considered to be a PC move. You know, to get off on someone in front of the cops is equitable to dry snitching or asking the cops for help. In essence, it's almost like you're telling them, hey, I've got issues in there, I can't live here, you gotta get me up out of here. What he's supposed to do is wait until the cops leave the tier. Then he's supposed to get off, which then puts him in a very bad situation. He's in a gang module by himself and he just took flight. 25 against 1. Those aren't good numbers, unless that is your Big U. Shout out to Big U. Notice how all this political rhetoric is always carved out in a way that sets you up for failure. That's why there's so many solid individuals that end up on the other side. The politics are nefarious and there's double standards everywhere. You put two individuals in the same situation under the same circumstances and you could have two different outcomes, because they're looked at in a different light. Status, history, likability, who these individuals are, what they've done in the past, who they know. These are the type of things that might determine one's fate and the other's perseverance. Anyways, getting back to the LA County Jail, it's a massive complex, and from everything I've been able to gather, it was built back in 1963. So the Los Angeles County Jail system consists of 9 separate facilities. You have the Men's Central Jail Complex, and then you have the Inmate Reception Center. Next, you got the Twin Towers Correctional Facility, and then you got North County Correctional Facility. Then you have the Pitches Detention Center that consists of 3 separate facilities: East, North, and South. The 9th and final facility is called the Century Regional Detention Facility that basically houses all the women. So now that I've given you a little bit of background and insight into this county jail, let me give you some of the details of this story and what happened in this particular incident. This story took place at 8:45 p.m. on July 3rd, 2005 at the Los Angeles County Men's Central Jail. I'm not going to specify what gang module this happened in, as it might tend to make it easier for people to identify my source using the process of elimination method, but my source said it happened in one of the gang modules on the 4,000 floor. So apparently in this particular module, there was a llavero by the name of Ronnie Molina, who I'm now going to identify as Toro from Pacas 13, who had an open line of communication with their big homies that were housed in 1750. So I'm not sure exactly who was housed in 1750 at the time of this incident, but everyone knows, barring some unusual set of circumstances, that 1750 is usually where they house Mexican mafia leadership in that jail. I know from other stories that I've told in the past that during this time, several Pilis had passed through the jail. Some of those that I remember include Popeye from Harpies, Mosca from the San Fernando Valley, Chuy from V&E, Lalo from Lomas, Gangster from the Avenues, and Chato from Arizona Maravilla, just to name a few. So sometime right before this incident occurred, within a week or two, an individual by the name of Benjamin Acosta, who I'm now going to refer to as Flaco from Lancaster, arrived at the LA County Jail and was housed in the gang module. So according to what my source told me, Flaco had been through the county jail on a regular basis. He was a frequent flyer, and he was somebody that was known to be in the mix. So for those of you that don't understand the street slang, the term in the mix, it usually means somebody that's either actively involved in the county jail politics or the Mexican mafia street affairs. So this could have been somebody that was either a pusher or a shaker on the streets, collecting Mexican mafia taxes, or somebody that was actively involved in a street group. Either way, this reference meant that Flaco wasn't no slouch. He was someone that was working with the fellas on some level. And the fact that he was a frequent flyer in terms of the county jail means that he was out there in the criminal element. At any rate, my source said that when Flaco came into the module, after about a week, he caught wind that he was under some type of internal investigation and that it pertained to the streets and the big homies. Furthermore, he said that the only reason that he was privy to that information is due to the fact that one of his boys, who was also in the module at that time, was part of the leadership. Otherwise, he said he never would have found out because for whatever reason, they kept this investigation under tight wraps. So the other thing my source said is that whatever Flaco did must have been real serious, because out of all the incidents that he's seen go down in the past, this one was handled different. And eventually he found out that they wanted this guy murked at all expenses, meaning that whatever it took to make it happen. And then he explained why this situation was different. He said when this incident was finally sanctioned and it went down, that it not only involved two waves of shooters, something that he had never seen before, but they also created a huge diversion using a lot of people, and he had never seen that before. The other thing that he said was relevant about this situation is that there was a long delay from the time this guy went under investigation until the time that they hit him. That there was a lot of people involved in the investigation up top, and that he believes it might have been because this guy was related to a Pili. He did say this was strictly speculation, but that he based this off of some of the tidbits that his boy exposed to him. So according to my source, ultimately the plan was to send a wave of 3 shooters at this guy. And that if they failed to get it done, that they sent a second wave of 3 shooters at this guy to finish him off. They also had a contingency plan to create a scrimmage, basically a human wall or a barrier to prevent anyone from rendering any aid or assistance to this guy. And finally, if need be, they plan to create a diversion and a state of chaos to confuse the deputies when they responded. So the first time the incident was planned for, everybody was ready to carry out their assignments and everything was in play. However, another incident kicked off in the jail that ended up canceling yard out on that day. So the very next time that they called yard for that module, everyone out to the yard. And even though nobody was saying or doing anything different, the tension was thick. So according to my source, these guys did a good job keeping this under wraps, and they spent a lot of time rocking Flaco to sleep. But the only reason that he felt tension is because he knew what was coming. So apparently the plan for the yard was for them to go out to the yard like they did every other time, and that they would get as much of their yard time as they could. And then those that were going to be involved in the incident would be given a signal, and then that would set everything in motion. So as they normally did, they went out to the yard that day and they started out with what's called their routine, which is basically exercising together as a collective while doing it in formation. This usually consists of burpees, different variations, Navy SEALs, and then calisthenics in between. So when they do the rutina, everyone lines up in formation, and then there's usually two individuals in the front, exercise coordinators, that are facing everybody else. They give quick demonstrations of the exercises that they call out, and then they keep the overall outside count. Then the entire collective follows their lead while keeping the inside count. And they all go down together in sync. I think I got a video. If I can find it, I'll throw it up for those of you that have never seen these type of exercises. So according to my source, some of the deputies used to try to regulate and stop these guys from doing group exercises, claiming that it promoted gang unity and gang participation. But then you had other deputies that just kind of let them do their thing. So after these guys finished working out as a collective, the yard broke up into smaller groups and everybody was just out there chopping it up. Altogether, there was anywhere from 23 to 26 Surenos that were out there on the yard at this time. And they didn't do nothing different than they did any other yard. Like every other yard, I'm sure they had a couple of guys that were considered to be workout fanatics that would work out together with the yard as a collective. And then when they were done, they go to the side and they'd either do their push-ups, a bar routine, or whatever other exercises they would do, but they would always be working out. Everybody else was just chopping it up, socializing, trying their hardest to keep on their best poker faces. You know, in situations like this, when somebody's about to be hit, everybody acts like they don't know what's going on because they obviously don't want to alert the target. Everybody tries to act like they're not paying attention to what's going on, but in all actuality, they can't stop from constantly looking in the direction where they know this individual is going to get hit. Like I said, you obviously don't want to spook the target or alert him that something's wrong, so you try to act normal to keep him at ease. But at the same time, people are addicted to violence, and when it happens, they don't want to miss it. I call it the rubberneck syndrome, the same thing people do on the freeway when there's a fatal accident. Everyone claims that they fear violence and they don't want to see it. But yet, when you have a fatal accident on the freeway, everyone and their mother slows down and rubbernecks so that they could catch a glimpse of some brain matter. You guys know it's true. Why do you think the freeway slows down every time they have a fatality? It's not out of courtesy for the first responders and law enforcement who have to clean that mess up. It's because everybody wants to see some gore. So anyways, the yard consists of a small enclosure that's got fencing and mesh wrapped all the way around it. It's actually on top of the roof. It's on one of the rooftops. Then you have a small station that's called a control booth that's usually occupied by either 2 or 3 deputies. So there's windows on the control booth that provides the deputies with clear vantage points of the entire yard. There's really not no blind spots out there. So one of the deputies that was working that day was a deputy by the name of Cliff, who was described by my source as being a straight shooter, meaning he was the kind of deputy that came to work and just did his job. He wasn't the kind of deputy that came to work for the sole purpose of shitting on the inmates. He just did his job, gave you what you had coming, nothing more, nothing less. So Clift was actually one of the 3 deputies that was assigned to work in the control booth that day. His job was just to sit out there and monitor the inmates during their yard time. So according to what Deputy Cliff would later write in his incident report, himself, along with 2 other deputies, were watching the inmates during their yard exercise time that day. And up until the last 20 minutes of their allotted yard time, the yard was uneventful. But at about that 20-minute mark, that the inmates executed a coordinated attack on an inmate named Benjamin Acosta, Flaco, almost as if they did it on cue. He noted that the other deputies, including himself, didn't see anything that would have led them to believe that someone gave a signal, but that all 3 of these deputies knew Ronnie Molina Toro to be the shot caller for that particular module. So they obviously knew that Toro had to have sanctioned the green light. And believe it or not, this information was based on self-admission and some of Toro's past conduct within the jail. Apparently in the past, there was a few incidents that involved some of the Surenos that were housed in the gang module and deputies that had worked there in the past. And as a leader, Toro would interject himself by stepping forward for the sole purpose of seeking resolution whenever an incident like this would arise. His objective would obviously always be to defuse the situation and to stop it from escalating. Because whenever there's an issue between a deputy and an inmate and it's not resolved and it just continues to escalate verbally, at some point the deputy will not only assert his authority by going into the module and shaking down the inmate that he had a conflict with, but he'll also shake down some of his boys as well. And that's to teach him a lesson. It's a way for the deputy to reaffirm who's in control and, like I said, to teach him a lesson. And obviously Toro, being a leader of that module, would surely want to avoid having their cells get shook down and running the risk of their contraband being intercepted. Because trust me, when we're doing time, we like our contraband. Our razors, our pen fillers, our kites, our lighters, our tobacco, and whatever else we can get our hands on. But during the course of Toro interjecting himself and stepping up as a representative for his people, he in essence identified himself as the leader of that module. In fact, one of the deputies would later testify at Toro's trial that Toro said verbatim that he was in charge of that pod, and that if there was ever any issues with his people, to get at him and he would take care of it. And later, when issues did arise, Toro ended up being the go-to guy that these deputies would go to whenever they had a problematic individual or a situation that involved the Surenos as a collective. You know, it's common to have an open line of communication with the COs or deputies in county jails or prisons, because a lot of the time it's better to have an open line to resolve issues than to see them escalate. And this is far from what is considered to be working with the cops. People can try to spin it however they want to spin it. But this is a symbiotic working arrangement that actually benefits the inmates more than it does the cops, especially from the perspective of an inmate. Because at the end of the day, no matter what, we always end up on the losing end. They hold all the keys and they push all the buttons, but they end up finding out who's in charge anyway, just by common observation. They watch the inmates' movements and their daily interaction, and they eventually end up figuring out who's who, either because of the way other inmates interact with certain individuals, or maybe because of a particular cell that gets an excessive amount of communication or an excessive amount of phishing whenever somebody new comes in, or because they just watch the body language of the inmates. If you watch long enough and you know what to look for, eventually you're gonna see the signs. But for Toro, this ended up being one time when having an open line of communication worked against him, because later they used this information against him, and this is what buried him. They identified him as the shot caller, and this was substantiated based on the fact that he even admitted it himself. Or as they said it, he made a self-admission. So when these three shooters executed this coordinated attack on Flacco, they did it with bangers. All three of them had weapons. Furthermore, Cliff wrote in his report that when these three shooters executed this coordinated attack, there was about 5 or 6 other Surenos who worked in unison to form a scrimmage. As I explained when I talked about the contingency phase of this assignment, a scrimmage is basically a human wall or a shield that's created to form a barrier between any potential interference that might attempt to render aid, or possibly to obscure the view of staff that might be trying to see what's going on. But this only ended up being a temporary fix, because as soon as the deputies heard a commotion, they stood up so that they could see what was going on. You guys already know what's coming. Bing, bop, bing, boop, bop, shoot. Anyways, whenever there's an altercation or someone's getting dealt with, you always hear the telltale footsteps shuffling around or the screeching rubber that you hear on the wax floors. That almost sounds like a stampede. And then you hear the rumbling sound of bones and body parts hitting the concrete. Or again, as I described, the bing bop, bing bop, bing bop, oh my shoe. So when Deputy Cliff and the other 2 deputies stood up to see where the commotion was coming from, the scrimmage had shifted just enough so that they could see that Flacco was in the middle of a makeshift circle and he was getting stabbed. At one point, Flacco started screaming for help, and according to Deputy Cliff's report, he seen Flacco break through the scrimmage, butt-ass naked, and run towards the yard door. I don't know how this guy got blasted out of his clothes, but my guess is that when they beasted up on this guy, they grabbed him and they just ripped his shit off. Meanwhile, as Flacco started running towards the door, another wave of 3 Surenos went after him and started stabbing him again. By this time, it was obvious that they were trying to take this guy's win. Later on, one of the deputies even testified that this stabbing bore all the hallmarks of a prison-style stabbing and that it had the Mexican Mafia written all over it. That the level of violence alone was a clear indicator that these guys were willing to perform this assault in front of the deputies with complete disregard for any consequences. And although these guys were speculating, they later testified that the urgency that these guys exhibited clearly demonstrated these guys knew that they had to succeed in sending this guy to Brazil. Otherwise, they would have to face the consequences. So as Flacco continued to make his way towards the yard door, the 3 Surenos that were hitting him, they continued to hit him and they made no attempt to stop. At that point, Deputy Cliff and the other 2 deputies alerted other staff by sounding an alarm, letting them know that there was an assault in progress and that they needed backup. Then, going against their own policies, they opened up the yard door while the stabbing was still in progress and gave verbal commands for these guys to stop their assault. This is when these guys must have decided to go to the next phase of their plan, to have assigned squads of Surenos begin assaulting the deputies. It's clear that they wanted Flacco pretty bad. To involve this many people, to make this many sacrifices for the sole purpose of taking out one individual, it isn't rocket science. So now it's straight pandemonium out there. You got a couple of shooters that are still hitting Flacco, and now you got a couple of squads of Surenos that are fighting with the deputies. And you got the deputies fighting back and are spraying these guys with OC spray. But the Surenos still had one phase of their plan that they still hadn't executed yet. You had one group attacking Flacco, one group fighting with the deputies, and now you had another group that started fighting amongst themselves to create a diversion and a state of chaos. So basically, the entire module was involved in this incident. As for Toro, he ended up being one of the shooters that participated in the second wave that went after Flacco. Apparently at that point, they had him down on the ground, hitting him by the yard door. This is when Deputy Cliff and the other 2 deputies focused all their attention on spraying the shooters that were still hitting Flacco. Cliff would also state in his report that these guys actually even tried to take their cans of OC spray, that they tried prying them out of their hands. But apparently the deputies didn't allow this to happen and they continued to spray them. So after hitting these guys with multiple gusts of OC spray, Toro and 7 of his cohorts ran back into the building and ran towards the restroom, and they started dousing themselves with water, obviously feeling the effects of the OC spray. Meanwhile, it was around this same time when other deputies from other parts of the jail started arriving as backup. And several of these deputies were armed with sting ball grenades, which they started shooting at the inmates. So sting ball grenades are small canisters that are shot out of gas guns. They're shaped like small grenades, which is obviously where they get their name from. When shot, they detonate in the air and fire out small rubber pellets the size of ball bearings. So it ended up taking several minutes to prone everyone out and get them under control, but eventually they were able to do it. And for as much punishment as Flacco took, he was lucky to be alive. Ultimately, he ended up being stabbed 28 times in the face, neck, and head. A lot of his wounds ended up being superficial, but some of them were deep lacerations. He got lucky. It actually looked a lot worse than it was because Flacco was bleeding profusely and he was covered in blood. So after they got everyone under control, he was taken to an outside hospital where he was patched up and treated for his injuries. So after they took all the inmates off the yard and cleared the yard, the entire yard became a crime scene. All in all, they ended up recovering 7 inmate manufactured stabbing weapons that were made of metal. So again, either Flacco's a real lucky guy or these guys just didn't know how to stab him. So needless to say, Toro and several others were charged with attempted murder on Flacco. And they also hit him with a bunch of enhancements and strikes. So originally Toro was fighting another unrelated case that he would have only got 12 years on. He would have got 6 years for the actual case, and because he was a second striker, they were going to double him up and give him 12. But this new case turned that 12 years into a life sentence because this was now his third strike. So he was looking at 25 years to life on his third strike, plus an additional 10-year gang enhancement for 186.22. So following this incident and during the investigative phase of this case, Deputy Cliff interviewed every inmate that was housed in the gang module, plus an additional 100 to 150 other inmates throughout the jail. And he conducted these interviews in an effort to find out why Flacco might have been green-lighted. And although they didn't consider any of the information that they got back to be substantial or information that they could corroborate either way, they were given two theories by a number of different inmates. So one was that Flacco disobeyed a directive from the Mexican Mafia to pay for an attorney for a co-defendant on another case. I'm not sure about the details of why they elected to make him pay for this attorney. Maybe they felt that he was culpable in them getting busted on some level, or that he had the means to pay for it and that he just didn't want to do it. The other theory that seemed more plausible was that Flacco was misrepresenting his status as being a made member of the Mexican Mafia, something that the Mexican Mafia obviously doesn't like. Because they know that when somebody's misrepresenting their status and identifying themselves as a pili, that usually they have an underlying reason for doing so, such as collecting Mexican Mafia street taxes or using that status to mislead or misguide others. Because the Mexican Mafia might tolerate a lot of different things, but when it comes to stealing their money or collecting their street taxes, that's something that they don't play around with. Anyways, in the end, the LA District Attorney's Office ended up filing the criminal complaint against Toro for 667-187, attempted murder, plus they hit him with the 186.22, a gang enhancement. They also charged him as a three-striker, which obviously meant that he was looking at a life sentence. So he ended up losing trial, and they sentenced him to 25 to life, plus another 10 years for the 186.22, the gang enhancement. You know, I'm not sure what he was sentenced on his other case, or if he's caught other cases since he's been in prison, but now he's doing LWOP. Right now, today, he's housed in Corcoran State Prison at the age of 44. So he's got a tough, long road ahead of him. Right now, he's housed in Corcoran State Prison doing LWOP at the age of 44. So he's got a long, hard, tough road ahead of him. But if he was smart, he would have took a long, good look at his life and some of the choices he was making, and he would have used that as a stepping stone or a crossroad to head off in another direction. You know, it's obvious that he's become a high priority target for the Mexican Mafia, something that he should have took serious. Who knows? Sometimes people think that they can still navigate and maneuver around on the streets, believing that their street smarts and their savviness is enough to carry them and keep them on top of their game. So instead of riding off into the sunset and using what should have been a life-altering experience to change their life and their old way of thinking, they decide to stick around and continue playing a dangerous game. On a closing note, I appreciate all the feedback that some of you guys have been giving me with regards to these stories that I've been putting out. And like I said, I'll continue to mix them up and put them out. But ultimately, my goal is to put out more content for you guys. Anyways, I hope you guys have enjoyed this episode of Paradigm Profiles. If you guys like this episode, give it a thumbs up. If you didn't like this episode, give it a thumbs down. But either way, drop a comment and let me know what you think. As always, I just want to thank those of you who continue to show your unwavering support and also for just continuing to tap into the channel. With that said, you guys enjoy your week and continue to keep pushing that positivity. Until the next one, this is your boy B, and I'm gone.